Good evening, participants. Welcome back to today's lecture of our series called Literature Across the Ages, Literary Schools and Movements. And today, our resource person will be talking on the part 3 of Victorian Age, which will primarily deal with symbolism. And there are some other topics which we, with discussion with some experts, we had done it. And we are happy and privileged to have among us our resource person of the day, Dr. Josepheena John. And on behalf of Team DAATH VOYAGE, I would like to take the honor and opportunity of introducing Dr. Josepheena to all my dear participants. Dr. Josepheena is an educationist, academician, creative writer, poet, and editor, and is currently working as an assistant professor in the Department of English, Nirmala College for Women, Coimbatore in Tamil Nadu. As a creative individual, Dr. John's journey through the phases of literature has been adventurous and challenging. Dr. John celebrates the comprehensive creative abilities that she possesses that include painting, dancing, creative writing, poem composing, lyric writing, editing, and English language training. Although Dr. John is a very cheerful enthusiast when it comes to literature, she has a deep aesthetic attraction to classical literature and poetry. She specializes in Canadian literature aesthetics with emphasis on 19th century literature. So basically, these particular topics which she'll be discussing today are from in the area of forte. So we can expect a very interesting and intriguing as well as enriching lecture today. On behalf of Team DAATH VOYAGE, Dr. Josepheena, I welcome you. Thank you very much for taking out your time, putting in so much of effort for this particular lecture. And we are looking forward for your lecture. And thank you once again from Team DAATH VOYAGE and myself. Without wasting much time, the platform is all yours, Dr. Josepheena.
Yeah, thank you so much for that brief introduction and well elaborate one. Thank you so much. I'm actually humbled by this opportunity given to me. And good evening to everybody. Good evening to each and everybody who's here in the part of this lecture series. And I wish, before I could commence my presentation, I wish all of you success in all your endeavors. So with that, we will start this particular series of lecture. And here I'm going to talk about Victorian Age, part 3, which is given to me. Before we could go into the parts of Impressionism or symbolism and the topics given to me, I'd like to just brief up or give an idea of how it used to be. And let me tell you that the 19th century, or this Victorian age as such, is the most, the vibrant age of the entire history of English literature, according to my perspective. And I think you would also, accept or you'd also consent to the same idea, because when you think of Victorian age, the first thing that comes to your mind is obviously Queen Victoria, who was the ruler of that particular age. Whereas when you think of the world in itself, the world was going through a constant change, which was considered to be the Industrial Revolution. And if I have to enlist the kind of things that were invented or discovered during this particular age, the list just goes on. And if I could name a few, it would be camera. The invention of camera came into being. Then you have the railways, you have the steam engine, you have a telephone, and then you have the trains, bicycles, typewriters, radios. Quite a lot of things were invented during this particular age. And when we think of Victorian age as such, there are a few points and characteristics of the age, and I would like to brief and I would like to give a full discussion about this in the next slide. Yes. So when we have a glimpse of the Victorian age, the period of this particular age, it is approximately, because we cannot name when this started, even if it was during the reign of Queen Victoria, we cannot name exactly when it started, or we cannot give a precise date. So even if we are learning for exams, when we're preparing for these exams, we can only tell an approximate period of the age, and that it falls from 1820 to 1914. When we think of the Queen Victoria's reign, it is from 1837 to 1901. And if you want to brief up and if you want to detail study of it, every heading, like for example, Queen Victoria's reign, can be taken for consideration and learning. Now, when you take Victorian age as such, it is an age of progress. Progress not only in economic status, it is also in the intellectual status of human being and the emotional status of people who lived around the world, not only in places of Britain and London. But if you think of the entire world, there was a huge change because of progress, which was through industrial revolution. And like I told you, there were a lot of breakthroughs, revolutionary breakthroughs of art and science during this particular age. And it was also an age of reform, because many ideas that we were, or the people of that particular previous age were clinging on to, was brought to a huge place of discussion and change during this particular era or particular age. And the next one is social age, because many political movements like socialism, feminism, liberalism, Marxism, all these took birth during this particular age. Though the thought process started when the Romantics started their freedom of learning, later this particular age was the time when they took the freedom and they took the courage to tell the world that this is what they believed in. So this age of progress, reform, and social change is what Victorian age is all about. And it was also a time of economic growth. Like I told you, trade was one thing that flourished around the world, and people started flying towards places. For example, through flying in the sense they were traveling, they were discovering new places. They started trade, they started exchange of ideas. There was success in all those things that they did. I think business was booming, if I could say. Trade and business was booming during the Victorian age, and the Queen was also happy about it. Though the religion that was prominent of that particular age was Christianity, there was not much of violence that was there in literature, but there was flourishing prosperity around the entire world. For example, if you see the inventions of electric light bulb and the inventions of phonograph, which is nothing but voice recorders, the invention of power boats, typewriters, radios, and the most important part is the population growth. So when people started moving for trade, there was something called as human resource development, if I could name it from the most modern words. The Victorian age had something called as the human resource development and economic development, which was booming. And people started investing more in trade and investing more in learning more ideas from all around the world. And at the same time, arts and science was something that people used to debate over, talk about, and they formed groups of people with same opinion and ideas, and more like an open mic forum of the 19th century. People with the same ideas, they came across people with related ideas, they grouped together, they started a movement, and with that movement, they started a social change, and with that, they brought reforms in the society. So I think the 19th century is what has made the world think different. And till then, what we started compartmentalizing as literature started rooting its ways into other forms of work, like, for example, science. Then we had anthropology, then we had architecture, then we had syntax, what do you call it? The semantics, the knowledge of words. And then you have people going into painting, and then people supporting music. So there was a huge, it was more like opening a box full of ideas and giving into literature, and literature started taking its roots in every sense possible. So it was not compartmentalized. I think when literature people start explaining it to the world, or people who love literature explaining it to the world, it is only because of the 19th century, predominantly because they started putting their ideas into other forms of art and science. And with that, psychology, philosophy, art, architecture, and music also started playing a predominant role in the field of literature. And that's the reason why when people started thinking in the 19th century, they started thinking in groups of not only metricized language, but it also went into literature as science and knowledge. So we'll see the first topic of this particular lecture, Impressionism. So, like in the slide, you will find that Impressionism is an art or is a movement by a group of people from France. But it not only pertained to literature, but it also pertained to painting, sculpture, architecture. It was also predominant in music, cinema, and photography, and it was also predominant in literature, philosophy, and psychology. So let's see how it has made its way in all the ways, in all the genres of learning, and how it, kind of canopies everything under the same umbrella term called Impressionism. Um, so, since Britain expanded their territory throughout the world and it became the largest, richest, and most powerful empire in the world history, Queen Victoria, like we all know, she was also considered, she was also given the post of the Empress of India. So you should understand that Victorian science and culture itself is a different, book or genre to study, and it invests a lot of time when you're going to prepare for your exams. But when we think of schools and movements, before we talk detailed about Impressionism, we should understand what is the difference between schools, and we should understand what's the difference between movements. The two are totally relatable, but at the same time, it has a meager difference. So schools refers to a group of people, they share the same idea and they reflect the same idea, and they adhere to certain methods, common goals, principles, theories, and they're inspired by some artwork or inspired by a person or inspired by a philosophy. And so that they group together, and they come to an idea that, okay, we all have the same idea, let's start a school or a movement, a school of thought, so that the people can understand what we're trying to talk about or what we're trying to emphasize on. And when it comes to movement, it is a new development in the already existing theories, where and they try to give more importance to techniques, and they also try to express the interest, thought, and principle. So when it's a movement, it is because they develop something that is already existing. But in a school of thought, it is a group of people coming together and giving ideas and methods of art. So Impressionism, the opposite of this word Impressionism itself means realism. It's like real life. And Impressionism is something called as what you find as just an impression that is made in your mind. So one example that I can give you is though it started in the late 19th century, Romantic poets like Wordsworth also had Impressionism in their works. When you take the poem, the very famous poem, The Daffodils, he says, when I consider, when, mm, yeah, he says, when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, and they flash upon the inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. So he tries to represent the daffodils as a thought process that came to his mind when he was lying on his couch. So imagine if Wordsworth was a painter, he would have painted just the glimpse of the idea on canvas. Now that is Impressionism. The glimpse of idea that is processed from the mind and put onto the canvas or art or writing, that is called as Impressionism. So when it comes to painting and sculpture, let's see some examples. Which will be in the later slides. Now I'm just going to talk about this particular movement. So in France, it was implemented, or this movement initially developed by a group of people. They were French-based artists. So during the period 1870s to 1880s, they were French-based artists, and they had this idea of representing art as a visual experience. For example, imagine facets of light. Now, for example, the same thing, you're listening to a lecture and you find me having the light right facing to my face. Now, if I'm going to switch off the lights and keep it to one angle, that will show another perspective of light to you. And the same thing, when we watch movies, we find that, these directors use these exceptional ideas of having lights and the action imposed in such a way that the people understand who is the important person in that particular frame. So this Impressionism, as the letter Impressionism, that's a French word. It was developed it was developed because one of the French-based artists had put up a painting called Impressionism Sunrise. And in that, one of the critique had spoken, his name is Louis Leroy. He said that it is just an impression, it's just a sketch, and it's not real life like. So when that commentary was made, they took up that particular term from that critique's word, and they put it as a movement. And it was during the late and early 20th century that this particular movement came into being. And the idea of creating an impression, for example, when we see somebody for the very first time, we have an impression of them created in our minds. So that is exactly what these people started portraying in their works, and they started portraying in their canvases or photography skills. And they also try to visualize, experience what came to their mind, and they also used contemporary subjects. So you should understand that late 19th century and the early 20th century is predominantly after the war. So what you see people, they'll be bustling, they'll be literally running around in order to boost the economy. They'll see people rushing around in places like, a party, and they go to balls and they go to gatherings. There's a lot of scenarios that they see in contemporary literature in the time that is late 19th and early 20th century. And what they capture is fleeting impressions. For example, when you're traveling in a bus or train, you see a lot of glances or glimpses of places. Now, that is exactly what these people who loved art, who captured fleeting impressions, they transferred that idea into characters, story plots, settings, and events. And they also try to bring a subjective appearance. For example, a personal experience of how they felt. Now, when it's raining and we're sitting at when we're traveling, we find those rain droplets falling down. Crisscrossing across the window panes of the car or anything that we travel, and we find a blurred or bokeh effect of that particular scenario, and it tries to bring an imprint in our minds. Now, that's exactly what is called as subjective. If it is invoking your personal belief, if it's invoking your personal feeling, even though it's a fleeting impression, it stays. So they bring that writer's narrative and moods and perception without any filters, exactly how you feel it, and they try to picturize it into the works that were written. And the edges of reality are blurred. For example, imagine you want to portray a person who's really sad, and then you find a person traveling in the same way. So when you listen to a song, that your favorite song, now that is where literary impressionism plays a part, where you forget the realities of the world and you try to superimpose the idea of impressionism, where your only focus is the music that you listen to and the blurred image that you find in the window pane when it's raining. So when you choose a particular idea and then you superimpose that image of impressionism in your mind, you are actually reliving the ideas of the 19th century or the late 19th or the early 20th century group of artists who were from the French background, who were trying to capture fleeting impressions and making it as an art. Now, there are some examples, or there are some literary works that has superimposed this idea of fleeting impressions, and one such is Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. Now, when we think of Virginia Woolf, we understand she's somebody who is a writer who has presented what came to her mind without any filters. So when you see Mrs. Dalloway, it's a fictional story, as I recall. It's a fictional story of a upper class woman, and the central theme of that particular work is the fear of death. So this Mrs. Dalloway has this fear of death throughout that story. And that particular reason, fear of death, is allowing her to understand that every small moment in our life is important. At the same time, it's also sometimes threatening. Now, when we know that, when we think about people who think about depression, then we understand that every small moment, the little happiness, is also very important when it comes to the fleeting glimpses of life. So same way, Virginia Woolf in this particular story, Mrs. Dalloway, she tries to voice out through the character Mrs. Dalloway on the fear of death. and how every small incident that happens is a central theme of particular novel, and that helps her to focus the beauty of the moment, like the carpe diem, like seize the moment kind of feeling, and forget the reality of the world around it, forget the reality of the upper class women and their problems. Now, when we see the next novel, A Season in Hell by Arthur Rimbaud. Rimbaud is a French term, so it's Rimbaud. A Season in Hell it's an extended poem in prose style, and it talks about the quarrel between the poet and this particular character called the other. It's like two different characters. The poet is talking to somebody called the other, which is none other than himself, but in his own perspective. Now, if you had to take Arthur Rimbaud and take a psychological study about him, people would call him or would term him to have bipolar disorder, because when you read that particular work, you will understand that both these characters have so much of reality that you do not know if Arthur is trying to talk for the writer or for the other person there. So there's a quarrel between the poet and the other, and the two voices are at work at the same time. So if we were trying to analyze him, we would put him into a category called, maybe he's got bipolar disorder, because both the characters have so much of impression and clarity at the same time. It's there throughout the work. The next work is The Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce. As we all know, James Joyce is an Irish writer, and this is his final work that he's written, and it has a heavy idea of impressionism in it, because it is a body of fables, like a lot of stories together. And there are two characters called as Shem and Sean, and Shem talks about one type of character which is very, very disciplined, neat, and how the society expects one to be. And Sean is a person who is eccentric, doesn't fit into the norms of the society, and some person who you cannot relate or understand. So it's a war between these two characters in this particular work. And the impression that is there in our mind is that, this particular work of James Joyce is considered to be one difficult work to read through, because it's a constant shift from one character to the other. And the impression that it leaves in our mind is, okay, this is how a person is expected to be, and the second character is the person is how a character is not expected to be in a society. That's the impression that falls in our mind. Now, the last one that I've stated in the slide is Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, and it is about, as we all know, Joseph Conrad is a Polish writer, and he tries to emphasize a story of the sailor and his journey in the Congo River to meet a particular person called Kurtz. So this Kurtz is a person who is very idealistic man, and he's got a lot of ability. So what happens is, when it's a journey of meeting somebody. So the impressionism that is created in our minds is that we always look up to somebody and we go in search of them in the idea that we learn something much more from it, but the reality is otherwise. There are many stories like that. If you take the movie Castaway, which is very famous, which I'll be showing in one of these slides, you'll understand that these people have created an impression in our mind that sailors are this way. They go in search of something. They go in search of understanding themselves, the search of within. So there is a literary impressionism that is created in all these literary works, and predominantly these four works stand as highlighting the literary impressionistic works. Okay. So I've given you examples in different genres, and one among them is paintings. So the first painting, if you see, you'll find it's actually by Claude Monet, and it's called as Impressionism Sunrise. The reason why this particular moment got its name is because when this person, Louis Leroy, saw this particular painting called Sunrise, this first painting, he just looked at it and he said, it's a good painting, but it lacks lifelike, quality, and it's just an impression of it. So that particular term was taken from the critical analysis of that particular person who saw this art. Now, in that first painting, if you see, you will find that there's a lot of light work that is there in the particular artwork, where you find the sun's rays or the sun's the rays on the water, and then you find that you know when you see it, you know it's either dusk or dawn, and you know that's the kind of lighting. It's not too dark, it's not too bright for a day to begin with. So it's more like dusk. It's free for interpretation because it's impressionistic art. And you also find that this was painted in the year 1872, which is when this particular group of painters started telling the world that this is also a way where you can create it. This is not lifelike, but it's the impression that is in my mind, where I've seen a particular picture frame, and I've tried to inculcate that in a canvas. Now, the second painting that you see is much more realistic, but at the same time, it lacks lifelikeness. You find it's actually painted by Pierre Auguste Renoir. It's titled as Dance at the Moulin de Galat. So it's a dance, and it's a celebration that we see in that painting. And you'll also see the minute shadow of the trees that fall upon these people. Though it's not lifelike, it has the impression that is created in the mind of the painter, and that is related, that is exactly given on the canvas, and there's nothing much more to it. And the lighting also, you see, it's a celebration. You see people walking around, their shadows falling on the canvas. Everything is there, but it's not lifelike. So that is exactly what these impressionists wanted to tell the world. This is what comes to my mind, and that's what I want to relate to paper or canvases. And the third painting you see is Poppies. It's a painting. Yes, it's a painting by Claude Monet, and you find that the poppies are literally dots, nothing more. It's not very bright. They use subtle colors. It's very, very simple. It's there. It's just there. You just, dab a little paint and then make it seem right. You also find, a house a mansion far away. And you also find a lady of the Victorian age holding an umbrella and a kid standing by. So these are some things that has been, and you'll also find another lady walking with another kid far away, which is an impression that is there in the painter's mind. So impression is, they try to relate what comes to their mind, or what is impressed in their mind, superimposed images in their mind into canvases. The next one is very, very important, is the sculptures. Sculptures also took a turn, or was, these people who invested this time in sculptures, they also tried to bring a lot of impressionistic qualities in these sculptures that they did. One among them is Gates of Hell, which is a beautiful work by Auguste Rodin. Auguste Rodin is considered to be one of the most predominant figures of sculptures in impressionistic ideas. So you find, if you just Google, sculptures in some impressionistic terms, then you'll find many of his sculptures. One among them, which is predominant and very, very important, is the Gates of Hell, where you don't find lifelike figurines. They're just figurines that show human or body-like structure, but it lacks precision. For example, if you're somebody who wants real lifelike structures and sculptures, then Impressionism is not your place to admire them. You'll find them as, half done or not perfectly done kind of sculptures. So the second one is Waves by Victor Mitroshin. You'll find a lady or a ladylike figurine sitting there. It's with the hair flowing by. You can interpret in any way you want it, but this is a beautiful sculpture which is by this particular person, and it actually reflects Impressionism. And the third one is Camille Laudil's L'Implorant, that is to implore, to ask for something. So when you see the third sculpture, you'll find a ladylike structure imploring or asking for something, leaning towards somebody. So it's more of what the artist had in mind. He superimposed that image that came to his mind and made it a sculpture. Now you see, many of the sculptures are impressionistic when it does not have a superimposed or super real life quality to it. And the next genre is architecture. So if the Eiffel Tower, or the Eiffel Tower, like you call it, I'm not telling the person who built it. I'm giving more significance to the architect himself, is Stephen Sylvestre. So when you see the Eiffel Tower in Paris, you find that it is not complete. It is just a steel structure. It's just a structure that it's got an A shape to it, but then it is also a symbol of love, or a symbol of the Paris itself, the place Paris itself. And when you see Eiffel Tower from far, you have an impressionistic image that it's got from its steel structure. Now the second one is Casa Batlló. It's a Barcelona. It's in Barcelona, and it's done by an architect called Antoni Gaudí. And when you see this, it looks like more of a fantasy kind of a structure. And only when you go far away from this particular architectural marvel, you will find that this whole color makes sense. It's more like a puzzle. The farther you go, it makes sense to you. The same thing with the when we go closer to the Eiffel Tower of Paris, you'll find that it's just a structure. It's just a structure full of steel and rods. But when you go far away, you find the magnificence of that particular architecture. Now you also have the most modern architecture. There is a foundation. It's called as a foundation by Louis Vuitton, which is a famous company by Frank Gehry. When you go closer to the building, you'll just find it like a glimpse of the wings of an insect. But when you pan far away, you'll find that this architecture has a design to it. Now that's Impressionism. The farther you go, that'll make more sense to you, and it'll give you an image of what was the impression in the artist's mind. The next one is in music. In music, Impressionism played a very huge role. It is because there's some, you can Google about it and listen to these pieces. These are marvelous ones because they don't have clarity in tone. Okay, it's the whole orchestration of music is where instruments, they started playing it in new ways. And the flutes and clarinets, they had a darker and lower tone to it, whereas the other music, like the chords and the keyboards or the piano, like we use it these days, that was given more significance, and the others just played an outline to it. It's more like a background music. And these people who used Impressionism in music, they started bringing unusual chord combinations. For example, sudden jam music, and then it goes subtle, and then there's a sudden fall in music. It's a huge thing, and there was no tonal structure to it. So if you're somebody who understands music, this will be something that's so relatable, because they use different scales of music, and they also use modes. For example, sudden low, sudden, there'll be a major fall and a minor lift in the whole music composition. And the rhythm also was different. For example, when you take classical music like Beethoven, or when you take classical music of any person of that particular Mozart, and when you listen to it, you'll find there is the continuity of music in it. It's continuously. I think with music composers in our world, like if you take A.R. Rahman for that matter, he would have also had a lot of superimpositions. For example, music like Vande Mataram, when it was first sung, it didn't have any tonality to it. It was classical. And then when somebody came in and brought his Impressionism into it, you find there's a huge introduction of Western music to it. There's a style to it, superimposing ideas to it, and the scales and models vary. So some examples are Claude Debussy's La Mer, which was composed in the year 1905, Maurice Ravel's Bolero, which was composed in 1928, Paul Dukas' La Peri, and Frederick Delier's On Hearing the First Cuckoo in Spring. Now, these are just my picky selections, which I like the most in the classical music, especially from the Impressionistic era. The next very important thing is, though we talk about literature, we should understand after literature what happens. It gets turned into music, it turns into cinema, it turns into photography. It's not just text that is given into words and presented to us, but it is a whole new era that was brought to the world. So when we think of cinema as such, we understand that in this Impressionistic cinema, they used superimpositions. For example, if you see these pictures that I've given here in the slide, you'll find how you've got ideas. For example, the first one, Jose, is a movie which talks about death. Now, when you see that particular frame, it is so understood that there's somebody carrying a cross, which is a symbol of, a symbol of death, or the symbol of after death, what happens. And we understand that it's a very dark kind of movie. So superimposing ideas into films was something that the Impressionistic era brought into the world. And they used filter over the lens. For example, blurred images, vintage movies. Now, even now, when we see vintage as a reel on Instagram or on our, anything that we take, it always brings rusticity to it. And I think only the 19th century people had the real life experience of superimpositions, where they used filter over their lens, and they used curved mirror, for example, a fish eye lens, to give a perspective of the director, how we thought of it. For example, if you're dreaming, how will a dream appear in a cinema? It's going to be blurred. It's not going to give you real life like images. And they used to frame a shot with slow motion and camera movements in order to show it's a part of a dream. So that superimposing idea of showing blurry images, and for example, if you take the movie English Patient by Michael Ondaatje, there's a series of things where he tries to show it as a director of dreams, of a lot of dreams. Now, if you take movies, let's say Bombay, the movie Bombay, even in that, in order to show violence, you blur the effect to show the violence. There are some movies where you want to show a killing scene and then you show a blurred effect on that. All these are taken from the lessons of the 19th century impressionistic artists. And until 1923, camera devices, they did not have clarity in it. Like I told you, it was the era when camera was introduced to the world. That was the first time we are trying to take clearer images, and that happens, we used filters. We started using colors. So the second image that you see of cinema, Man of the Sea, you'll find it in a very sepia yellow tone to the camera to show that it was of the earlier times. And the third movie that I've suggested here is Loving Vincent. Though Vincent van Gogh, the painter, does not fall in the Impressionist era. He falls in the post-Impressionist era because he tried to bring impressions but give real life structure to it. And it is believed that his quality of painting did not deteriorate, but it went into the Impressionism and distinguished itself in that particular genre. And here the subjectivity, the expressing the originality, was there in camera devices, and all these movies that I've suggested in this slide tries to give a glimpse of impressionistic ideas. Now, in photography, how did we capture this impressionism? Now, if you see the first picture, it was taken by a photographer called Edward Gordeev, and when you go to see his Galleria on Google or Microsoft Edge, wherever you search engines, if you search this name Edward Gordeev, you'll find beautiful pictures, and you'll find them. These are photographs, not paintings. These are photographs taken by the photographer himself, using a lot of filters by himself. For example, he brought that vintage quality on frame. That's not easy to bring in. Like if you really invest your time in photography, you will understand it's very difficult to bring in filters and at the same time bring the reality to it. So impressionistic people brought a lot of reality by blurring the images and trying to make it lifelike through the lens of the viewer or writer. And the second photo that you see is by Emiliano Arano from the series called Pixels. This is most modern art, and this is most modern photography. It's water, and you see a bokeh effect of the water. This is exactly how a person sees water under it. Underwater, this is how it seems like. But it's not real, it's not lifelike, it's not very crystal or HD kind, but it has an impression in our minds. So in philosophy, how did Impressionism play a major role? Is psychological principles. It gave importance to human consciousness, how human beings started thinking. So they do not think about the smallest of things. For example, if you take psychology, and if you're talking about the idea of stream of consciousness by Virginia Woolf, then you will see that you're not going to pertain thinking that how did Virginia Woolf think on day 1? How did she think on day 23? No, that's not how you're going to think about. As an impressionist, people used to think of the whole picture. You take the picture as a whole and understand that this person has the ability to transcend into different modes of or ages, and then try to bring reality to itself. So when human mind was taken as a whole and it took the consciousness as a whole and not into parts of it, that was how Impressionism played a role in philosophy. And we don't see real life, like natural things, as real world, but we perceive something. Now, for example, when we go to work environment, we perceive our behavior there. And when we understand, when we go to places where we admire art, we perceive a kind of audience there. So this perceiving idea, this notion of the world as a whole, is an impressionistic idea in philosophy. So for impressionists, taking as a whole of the human consciousness and understanding the smallest of emotions, memories, all those things as a whole. For example, if it's a sailor, as a whole, he's going to have a lot of experience than a person who's going to stay in the land and admire art. He's going to have a different perspective. So as a whole, you find it in philosophy. And in psychology, this is also a very important topic, because Impressionism has paved way into psychology. And in the most modern world, it has helped into creating data visualizations and also made art aesthetically pleasing. It is not always real lifelike portraits, but even in data visualization, we have the super impressionism or impressionism imposed in our minds. So when you take the idea of matrix, the idea of transcendentalism as a whole, when you try to paint that into canvas, you can only show certain things to it. And those certain things are enough according to the impressionist artists. And they try to say that artistic style has to be characterized on the emphasis of textures or high color. It's not only the idea that has to be implemented on canvas or on psychology, but it is also the different shades, different moods of a character. Now, like I told you, Mrs. Dalloway's character, it talks about the fear of death. Now, when we talk about the fear of death as a whole, we understand the different phases of death. When a person travels, when a person is sleeping, when a person is talking to somebody, when a person is going to miss somebody. These are all different variations of human mind. And when you talk about psychology and the varied expressions of the human mind, Impressionism played a very major role, because it was aesthetically pleasing. It was something comprehensible. For people who read it, it was easily comprehensible.